Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher hisanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Praise to you, Lord of God, who rule the universe, who has made us slay with your commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. So this evening will be one where I do a lot of talking, and I will try to pause for questions. Our topic is Talmud 101, Introduction to the Talmud. On one foot, the Talmud is a set of discussions by rabbis about how to live a Jewish life, particularly after the destruction of the Second Temple. It is comprised of the Mishnah, which was finalized in 200 CE, and the Gemara, which was finalized around 500 CE. There are actually two Talmuds. When people say, quote, the Talmud, they refer to the Babylonian Talmud, but there's also the Jerusalem Talmud, which was finalized around 400 CE. So, what is the Mishnah? The Torah tells us many things, but it's a little fuzzy on details. For instance, what does it mean to keep Shabbat? How do people become husband and wife? What exactly is a sukkah? A lot of things had to be figured out as the Jews settled in the land of Israel, and many discussions occurred. Additionally, in 70 CE, the Romans burnt the Second Temple, destroying Judaism as it had been practiced until then. There's a legend that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was smuggled out of besieged Jerusalem inside a coffin, and he convinced the Roman general to let him and his students set up in the town of Yavne. We find this legend in Gittin 56a, among other places. These discussions continued in Yavne, sometimes with rabbis teaching small groups of students, such as when the Romans were persecuting them, and sometimes with rabbis teaching and discussing with larger groups. Each rabbi would orally pass on what they remembered and what they'd been taught by their teachers. Some of the time was also spent discussing the Torah and trying to derive meaning from it through making connections. This became Midrash. The rabbis of this time were known as Tanaim. Eventually, as Roman persecutions increased following the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 CE, Rabbi Akiba started recording some of these teachings. His student, Rabbi Meir, took over after Rabbi Akiba was murdered by the Romans. Rabbi Meir made sure to record the dissenting opinions as well. The work was finished under Rabbi Meir's student, Rabbi Judah Hanassi. He used anonymous opinions to indicate his teacher, Rabbi Meir's views, assuming that everybody agreed with him. If there were other opinions, Rabbi Meir's got labeled. To illustrate the process of creating the Mishnah, imagine that Rabbi Judah Hanassi had a huge number of index cards in front of him. I recognize they didn't exist back then. Each card had a rabbi's teaching about something on it. First, he sorted the cards into 6 piles: Zra'im, which is about agriculture, including blessings over food; Moed, sacred times; Nashim, women; Nezikin, damages; Kodshim, holy things; and Tohorot, purities. These 6 piles became the books of the Mishnah. For example, Seder Moed. In the song Who Knows One from the Seder, this is Who Knows 6. 6 of the books of the Mishnah. Then he sorted each pile into smaller piles. For instance, the Moed, the sacred times pile, got sorted into smaller piles: Shabbat, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, fast days, Purim, and so on. These became tractates, for example, Masechet Psachim. Then each pile got sorted into smaller piles. For example, Masechet Psachim would get broken down into piles for eating leaven before the holiday, piles for removing leaven, another pile for Passover sacrifice in the temple, a pile for the modern Seder, and so on. These became chapters. Finally, each chapter is broken down into smaller pieces. For example, chapter 10 would have smaller pieces about the first cup, karpas, the 4 questions, and so on. These are known as a Mishnah with a lowercase m. The format for indicating a text from the Mishnah is Mishnah, and then the tractate name, and then the chapter, and then a colon, and then the Mishnah number. For example, if I wanted to find the Mishnah's version of the 4 questions, I would look in Mishnah Psachim 10:4. The Mishnah has 63 tractates, but they move quickly. Dr. Jacob Neusner's 1988 translation is a single volume of 1,187 pages with no Hebrew, but that's with taking every phrase and putting it on a separate line. The previous English translation, the first one to my knowledge, was by Reverend Herbert Danby of St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem, That was 880 pages with no Hebrew. In contrast, the Gemara takes up an entire bookcase. Of these 63 tractates, 62 have legal material and one is solely ethical teachings. That one is Pirkei Avot, which is a collection of wisdom quotes from the rabbis. There were teachings that didn't make it into the Mishnah. These were known as Baraitas, and they can be found in the Tosefta, as well as texts of Midrash from that time. Here's a way to think of Baraitas. When you roll out Hamantaschen dough, only some of it makes it into Hamantaschen. The parts that are left are equivalent to the Baraitas, and many of them make an appearance in the Talmud. So, that's the Mishnah. What questions are there about the Mishnah?
My foot got tired standing on it while you went through that whole thing.
Yeah, by that point, once we got to the Mishnah, we were not on the 1 foot anymore.
So the 1,167 pages, is that book still in print, still available?
Yeah, it's the Neusner translation of the Mishnah. You should be able to find it on Amazon. Personally, I've been making my way through it about 1 chapter every Shabbos afternoon. It's interesting reading. And 1 chapter every Shabbos afternoon takes like 5 to 10 minutes to read. If I wanted to spend a couple hours, I could make it through a couple tractates at least. The Mishnah moves quickly.
It's also fascinating to compare the language of the Danby from the 1933 and the Neusner from the 1980s.
David, is the Tosefta, is that a separate thing from the Talmud, or is that's part of the Talmud, right?
Yes. So there's the Tosefta and the Tosafot. The Tosafot are on the Talmud page. The Tosefta, I think, is a separate work, not in the Talmud, but you should be able to find it on Sefaria.
But the Baraitas are in the Talmud.
The Baraitas, yes, the Baraitas are in the sprinkled throughout the Talmud, starting from like page 2, which is the first page of the Talmud. But the entire Tosefta as a unit is not. It's a separate work. Tosafot are the son-in-law and grandson and assorted other students of Rashi from the 1100s, 1200s, I think, in Europe, giving their thoughts on the Talmud. The Tosefta is from the 200s in the land of Israel. So it's about 1,000 years and it's just a separate continent apart. And the Tosefta is the other material floating out there from that time, from those rabbis. That didn't go into the Mishnah. I also got a question in the chat about why the Mishnah was written down. And it was written down because of persecution and a concern that all of these teachings that had been passed down orally would not, like the chain of transmission would stop if the Romans kept killing the people who knew these things. So they decided to start writing them down. Other questions about the Mishnah? In the chat, there's a question about if the Torah is from God and the Mishnah is from man. It depends who you ask. The traditional interpretation on this is that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, he received not only the written Torah, but the oral Torah. This is not actually explicitly stated anywhere in the written Torah. There is a verse that is found in the very first Gemara of the first tractate, of which is Brachot, where the rabbis say that when it says that Moses received the laws and the commandments on Mount Sinai, the commandments refers to the written Torah and the laws refer to the oral Torah, or the other way around. It actually is slightly more detailed than that and has a couple more synonyms and says this one's the Mishnah, this one's the Gemara, this one's the Halacha. So that's one way in which the rabbis tried to make a claim that Moses received the oral Torah on Mount Sinai. Also, in Pirkei Avot, it begins with the rabbis making a claim to their authority, saying that Moses received the tradition on Mount Sinai, and he passed it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the Great Assembly. And then they said a few things, and then Simon the Just, Shimon HaTzadik, was the last of the men of the Great Assembly, and this is what he said. And then his student Antigonus of Socho said these things, and it has a chain of transmission. Again, you have to take the rabbi's word for it that this goes back to Mount Sinai. But the rabbis do make that claim that you should trust what they're saying because it actually came from God, as unverifiable as that might be.
A quick
Other
question.
people would, yeah, Gabriel.
I was gonna say really quickly, don't they also say that part of the claim to authority is also through Deuteronomy 17 in terms of new rulings?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's all I was wondering.
So to unpack what Gabriel just referred to, in Deuteronomy, it says that there's a discussion about listening to the magistrates, and there's a verse in that discussion that says you should listen to them and do what they say. And the rabbis interpret that them to mean the rabbis. And this is how they are able to say that when you light the Hanukkah candles, you should say in Asher Kichem B'Mitzvotav Tzivanu blessing that God has commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles, despite the fact that Hanukkah happened after the Torah was over, because God commanded us to listen to the rabbis, and the rabbis said to light the Hanukkah candles. So that is, you're absolutely right, that is another way in which they take upon themselves authority. Other people say that the Mishnah was human interpretation of the Torah. Some of these people also think that the Torah was divinely inspired, and some of these people think that the Torah was just written by humans altogether. A variety of views on that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I think
Okay.
I heard the last bit. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Yep. So there are a variety of views on whether the Mishnah is human interpretation or divine interpretation. For those who say it's divine interpretation, you have to deal with the fact that sometimes the Mishnah doesn't always say like what is the right answer about what to do, which is a little confusing. But I guess that's what the Gemara is for. Not that the Gemara always gives an answer either.
Since you mentioned Neusner, I thought I would ask whether Neusner or anybody else has discussed whether there are any ancient texts in which the authority of the rabbis or the authority of the Mishnah or the story of the transmission is disputed, or do we not have anything like that from an early period, if you know?
So I will admit that I read the introduction to the Newsner a very long time ago, so I can't make a claim one way or the other as to what he says about whether the authority of the Mishnah was disputed at any point. What I can tell you is that by the time of the Mishnah being written down, the groups that the Pharisees, who are the forerunners to the rabbis, the groups that they were wrestling with for control and authority, those groups had fallen by the wayside about 130 years earlier, thanks to the Romans. So by the time the Mishnah is written down, it is accepted as the authority. Part of this has to do with the fact that Rabbi Judah Hanasi he's the leader of the community. He also has the respect and the acknowledgement by the Romans. So he brings intra-communal authority and intercommunal authority. He also has a lot of wealth for what that's worth. And has the lineage going back to Hillel, who was a descendant of King David. So he's got a lot of authority in the Jewish community at the time. And because this is his work, it's pretty universally accepted. There are a few pieces that are still being added to the Mishnah after he's done. It's not totally finalized when he says, okay, and we're done. Because among other things, the Mishnah talks about when he dies. So some say that Rabbi Chia, who was one of his main students, had a hand in finalizing the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is pretty well accepted amongst the rabbinic circles of teaching by the time that the Mishnah is done. Now, how much it's a scholarly thing versus how much the rest of the Jews in the land of Israel are paying any attention to it, that I don't know. But amongst those who would care, it is accepted. Other questions about the Mishnah?
Yes, actually, really briefly. I know that like in archaeology, there've been discovered like other halachic texts from what would have been the opponents of the early rabbis, like from the Qumran community.
Yeah.
They had to fill in. I know they had to fill in. I know the Mishnah talks about them very briefly. Do you know anything about like the sort of difference at the time period between like the ordering of the scrolls inside the tefillin in the Mishnah compared to the stuff at Qumran?
I don't, but I can look into that.
Okay, because I was wondering if maybe the ruling that we find in the Mishnah, if it's sort of grew out of inter-community like sectarian debate between whatever people were doing at Qumran and the early rabbis.
Yes. In general, the Mishnah is responding to the events in the world around it, and that includes the discussions with the other Jewish groups, the Sadducees and the Essenes, amongst others.
Thank you.
Yep. There was a question in the chat as well about whether the Steinsaltz Talmud is the translation of the Jerusalem Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud. It is a translation of the Babylonian Talmud. There is an art scroll translation of the Jerusalem Talmud as well. Sorry. There is, okay, but that is correct. There is an art scroll translation of both of these.
And
I
Quran.
don't, and there's a Koran translation of the Babylonian Talmud. I don't know if Koren or Steinsaltz did a translation of the Jerusalem Talmud, but I do know there's an art scroll one. And now Safaria has the entire thing translated as well.
Yeah, Safaria has the Jerusalem as well now, I think, or at least parts of it.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Let's move on to the Talmud. So, how did we get to the Talmud? After the Mishnah was finished, it became the text that the rabbis studied and discussed. These rabbis are now called Amoraim. Because the Mishnah didn't give reasons for the different opinions in it, the rabbis tried to find a scriptural basis for the things in it. They also tried to reconcile it with other teachings they had received, the Baraitas. These discussions became the Talmud, both the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The term Gemara came into use when the medieval printers had to get around the church's censorship of the word Talmud. So on a page of Talmud, it will indicate when the next Mishnah starts by having mem tav apostrophe, and when it switches to Gemara, it will say gimel mem apostrophe. That is a convention that may date to after the term Gemara became more widespread. Jews had been in Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq, since 586 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple and exiled most of the Jews. Some returned to Judea under the Persians, others remained in Babylonia. More Jews came to Babylonia in 135 CE after the Bar Kokhba rebellion. By that point, Babylonian was part of the Parthian Empire, and the Jewish community was led by the Exarch, who claimed descent from King David via the king exiled in 586 BCE. The Parthians were overthrown by the Sassanids in 226, and Zoroastrianism, a religion with co-equal gods of good and evil, became something for the Jews to deal with. There were two main academies in Babylonia, Nehardea and Sura. Both academies would start with discussing the Mishnah, but then their discussions would go off on tangents. The discussions later got edited when they were written down, so it looks like the transcript of a conversation, even though not all the participants were alive at the same time. The reason that the discussions got written down was probably turmoil in the Sassanid Empire, leading to instability and a concern that the discussions of the previous 300 years should get written down. The editors, however, stayed anonymous. Questions about this part, the creation and writing of the Mishnah, of the Gemara?
Yes. Where are the, I don't know if this is the editors or the redactors or what, but what are the stamaim? Or if that's a question that's relevant here, maybe I have the wrong.
Yeah, no,
reference.
this is the right time for it. I believe the stamaim were either the editors or the redactors. They were my understanding is that they were the layer that came after the Amoraim, when the Talmud was being taken from just discussion into discussion woven together to create a cohesive piece of literature. However, I will double check that and get back to you. Other questions?
Yes, also, is it the Mishnah or the Gemara that primarily records the rulings of the Sanhedrin? Do both of them kind of do that? Or is like the Gemara more like a commentary on the rulings of the Sanhedrin?
To my knowledge, the Sanhedrin was primarily active during the time of the Mishnah. So it would seem likely that whatever it had concluded would be more likely to be in the Mishnah.
I see. Okay.
There may be rulings of the Sanhedrin that also make their way into the Gemara.
Thank you.
Yep.
Weren't some of the discussions in the Gemara from the recorded as being from the rabbis of the Sanhedrin?
So there is a Masachet, there is a tractate of the Talmud known as Tractate Sanhedrin, which is not a law book giving the rulings of the Sanhedrin, but rather it deals with, I believe, criminal law matters. So that's probably where some of the confusion is coming from. There are certain sayings of the Mishnah and the Gemara that are well known and are from Masachet Sanhedrin. For instance, the idea that whoever just saves a life saves an entire world, that comes from the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. And that was something that the Sanhedrin would tell witnesses in capital cases, saying, be careful of the testimony that you give. Make sure that you are not condemning an innocent person, because if you destroy one life, it is like destroying an entire world from that person's descendants and their descendants. And conversely, if you save a life, it is as if you have saved an entire world. That's from Sanhedrin. Also from that text is the idea that when God created humanity, God created only two people, so that nobody could say my ancestors are better than your ancestors. And that another thing from there is that when humans stamp coins from the same die, they all look the same. But when God makes people all in the image of God, they all look different. So sayings and quotes from Masachet Sanhedrin do come up from time to time. I don't know that there is one part of the Talmud that is just devoted to what the Sanhedrin had to say. But the Sanhedrin's rulings and, for instance, their rulings about whether it's going to be a leap year or not do appear in other places in the Talmud as well.
Intercalations and whatnot.
Mhm. Other questions about this? Seeing none, let's move on. So, how did the Talmud spread from Babylonia? The Muslims spread from Medina starting in 622 CE, and under the Umayyads, they conquered the Sassanians around 635 CE. The Abbasids took over from the Umayyads in 750 CE, and their Caliph, Al-Mansur, built Baghdad to be his capital. They built a library called the House of Wisdom and set out to translate the major literature of all languages into Arabic. This led to Baghdad becoming the intellectual capital of the Muslim world. The heads of the academies, known as the Gaonim, picked up and moved the Talmud to Baghdad. There, the intellectual ideas of the Talmud and of Islam mutually influenced each other. The communication networks of the Muslim world allowed the Babylonian Talmud and its ideas to spread. For example, the far-flung Jewish communities in the Muslim world sent letters to the Gaonim in Baghdad for advice. In one case, in the 800s, a question came from Spain about the Talmudic rule that one should say 100 blessings a day. The question was, what should those 100 blessings be? Amram Gaon sent back an answer that was effectively the first prayer book. Other questions came from other places, like North Africa and Egypt. Many of these were discovered in the Cairo Geniza in the 1800s. For example, there was a request in the 900s from Spain for a copy of, quote, the Talmud. It's not exactly known what was sent, but something got to them. Also, during this time, in the 800s, the Karaites got started as a group that rejected the Talmud and rabbinic Judaism. They only followed what it said in the Bible. For instance, the Bible said not to light a spark on Shabbat, so they sat in the dark rather than light a spark on Shabbat, but not on Shabbat itself. In the 900s, Saadia Gaon worked to counter the influence of the Karaites. Part of how he did this was limiting the influence of the Jerusalem Talmud, because then the Karaites couldn't say that the rabbinates couldn't even agree amongst themselves, so they must not be right. One of the other places where the Talmud went was Karaun in modern Tunisia. This city was a new intellectual hub of the expanding Islamic Empire. Hananel and Nisim, two different people, wrote commentaries on the Talmud there in the 1000s in order to make the Talmud more understandable to lay people who were beginning to study it. Among other things, their commentaries gave practical guidance in cases where the Talmud left things unresolved. One of their students was Isaac al-Fasi, who went on to write his own commentary on the Talmud. Another place the Talmud went was to Cordoba in Spain. Hizday ibn Shapru was one of the caliph's senior ministers in 940 CE, and he wanted Spain to have its own Jewish center, just like the caliph in Spain wanted to break free from the authority in Baghdad. Hizday set up an academy in Cordoba where the Talmud was studied. One of the star pupils in Cordoba, Shmuel, went south when Cordoba was destroyed, and he rose through the political ranks to also become a vizier, known as Shmuel Hanagid. Shmuel was the patron for another academy in Spain. In 1135, Maimonides was born in Spain. Under religious persecution, his family left for Fez and then Fostat, which is now Old Cairo. Maimonides, known as Rambam, was a doctor to the Sultan, but also wrote a commentary on the Mishnah and then wrote, quote, the Mishnah Torah, where he took all the laws of the Talmud, removed the back and forth, and reorganized them into new categories that made more sense to him. Questions about the spread of the Talmud?
As the Talmud was transmitted from one location to another, did it remain intact, or was it actually modified with each move because of the influence of where it went?
My understanding is that the Talmud itself remained intact, but the commentaries changed depending on where the commentator was coming from and what was going on in the world at that time. A good question. Other questions?
Yes, the authority of the Talmud at certain point was certainly questioned. You could argue about what it said in there. I'm not clear about when this was became more frozen in the tradition, where you wouldn't question the Talmud. I think Maimonides has the chutzpah maybe to organize the laws as you mentioned, as he saw fit, without even citing this Talmud, particular sections. And I think maybe Rashi questions it sometimes. I'm not sure, but at some point it became, in at least in a certain Jewish world, almost a revealed text, and you couldn't question it itself. And if you found different editions and manuscript conflicts as they did, that became a problem where it wouldn't be for an ordinary human text. It would. So that was my question.
Yes. As the Talmud spread, it became more fixed. And so it's not, whereas before it was, this is a work in progress. Now it's like, here's a thing. And you need to respect the authority of the thing and what it says.
Bill-
Certainly,
Oh, sorry.
certainly there were people who had questions about what it said and internal contradictions. And then part of the work of commentary was to resolve that and show that it wasn't necessarily disagreeing with itself. Justin, go ahead.
Well, what Phil kind of said reminded me of in our lessons last year, whenever we went through all the different denominations. I guess whenever the reform movement kind of started, that was and then the Orthodox movement was the Orthodox movement was the what's the term?
More conservative?
I guess the result of the reform movement. So
Yes.
I guess, and so then I feel like after that, I don't know. I don't know what the history is, if unless you do, maybe David or somebody else, but that's whenever it seems like, or at least what Phil was saying, where it became more revered, where in that it got more steadfast in the tradition and not asking questions, like where sometimes, at least from what I've seen, it seems like where the Orthodox movement is like less movement, like trying to stick with the original tradition, I guess. Whereas around the reform movement, they were trying to change that, I guess. Is that?
Yes, the reform movement originally did not think that the Talmud was worth hanging on to, or at least was not an authoritative text for them in modern life today as of the 1800s in Germany. And then the neo-Orthodox movement was like, what are you talking about? Of course it's authoritative. And now we will double down on how authoritative it is. So yes, I think you are definitely onto something there, Justin. There was a question in the chat about whether modern interpretations and commentaries are being cataloged and kept track of today. I would say a lot of that can be found on Safaria, but with the internet making everything diffuse, it is hard to keep track of everything that's being said about different parts of the Talmud today. That being said, with Safaria, when you have the ability to click on a passage of Talmud and then see everything that cites that passage across a variety of different learning sites and the source sheets, that gives you a tremendous ability to see modern interpretations of various Talmudic passages today. I don't know of anybody who has done the sort of, I will now comment on everything in the Talmud project that some of the previous scholars did, like Rashi, who we'll get to.
There's another consideration about the nature of the commentaries around the core Mishnah and Gemara texts, and that is that even within the Gemara, you could sometimes have people of vastly different generations arguing with each other, even though they never met each other.
Right. So in the same way that there are discussions across generations happening about text in the Gemara, that happens about the Talmud today.
Question about that. Just curious.
Yeah.
Whenever they'd have those arguments across the generations, sorry. Was that like, I guess all like, I guess there's no going back, right? So I mean, it's just like one generation says one thing and then the next generation goes on from there. Is that
right? They don't get to rebut it. However, one of the things that I love about the Talmud, and I don't know how this plays out going between generations, is that one rabbi will say one thing and provide a verse as evidence. A second rabbi will say something different and provide a verse as evidence. And then they make the first rabbi deal with the second rabbi's evidence and vice versa, which I think would make public discourse today and private discourse so much better if people would actually have to deal with each other's evidence as opposed to just like ignoring it. So I don't know if Rabbi A is from one generation and Rabbi B is from a second generation, how they make Rabbi A deal with Rabbi B's evidence. Perhaps it's by people who knew Rabbi A taking a guess as to what he would have said in response or how he might have interpreted it, even though he wasn't there to deal with it himself. All right, looking at the time, let's move on to Christian Europe. So around 1000, the Talmud moved from Islamic lands into Christian Europe via local Jewish merchants who had traveled to other places to get the goods they sold. These merchants learned about the Talmud and brought it back with them to the Rhineland. There, Rabbeinu Gershom ben Yehuda started the engagement with the Talmud, writing his own commentary on it and reconciling it to the situation in Christian Europe. Incidentally, he also put a ban on polygamy and on reading other people's mail. One of the students of Gershom's students in Mainz was Rabbi Shimon ben Yitzchak, better known as Rashi. Rashi's main job was growing grapes and making wine in Troyes, France, but he found time to write a running commentary on the Tanakh and the Talmud. His goal was not to find the bottom line, but rather to make things more understandable, either in terms of vocabulary or how logical jumps were made or things as such. Sometimes people will play a game called What is Bothering Rashi? Why would he bother to comment on this particular word or phrase? This commentary did much to make the Talmud more understandable to people. It was printed with a special font called Rashi script, even though Rashi never actually wrote in the script, and is always printed on the inside margin. So if you have two pages that are facing each other, it's the side that's closest to the middle of the book, where it is easy to find. In 1096, the First Crusade happened. On the way to kill, quote, infidels in the Holy Land, Christian crusaders stopped to kill Jews in the Rhineland as well. Why bother schlepping all that way when you've got infidels right around you? They also burnt the Talmud for good measure. Rashi's grandsons, Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam, were the first Tosafists who wrote their own commentary on the Talmud, working to resolve inconsistencies. Their commentary is printed on the other side of the Talmudic text, away from Rashi. Their approach was mutually influenced by Christian scholars of the time. In 1240, a Jewish convert to Christianity accused the Talmud of being anti-Christian, and so there was a debate in the Parisian court between said convert and his teacher. The situation was stacked against the Jews, and as a result, every copy of the Talmud, all of which were handwritten at the time, was collected and burnt. In 1263, there was another disputation in Barcelona between a Jewish convert to Christianity and Nachmanides. Although it ended in a draw, thereafter all copies of the Talmud had to be submitted to the church for censorship. In 1483, the Sonsino family printed the first volumes of the Talmud from a printing press. They borrowed the Christian approach of putting biblical commentaries on the same page as the text they were commenting on, and were the first to put Rashi and the Tosafot on the same page as the Talmud. They did not make it through all of the Talmud, however. That had to wait until 1523 when Daniel Bomberg, who was not Jewish, printed the first complete Talmud in Venice using the Sonsino's layout and with a few additional references on the page. He also added folio pagination, such as 2a and 2b, 3a and 3b, etc., for front and back of the same page. This was in vogue then, but then went out of style a bit later, yet it stuck for the Talmud. Page numbering itself only dates to 1470. Other printers saw how successful Bomberg was and printed their own versions with their own favorite commentaries, again, using Bomberg's general layout. In the 1770s, the Vilna Gaon and his student Elijah of Volozhin worked to make the Talmud part of the educational system for Jewish boys. Questions about the Talmud in Christian Europe?
So if all of these publishers or printers were adding their own commentaries, what is the Talmud in terms of its authoritative standing? Anybody could add their own commentaries.
Fair. So that was vaguely worded. They didn't use their own commentaries. They just picked and chose commentaries that other people wrote that they liked. So commentaries or other features of the text, like when the Talmud refers to a biblical verse, giving the citation so you can find it, or making connections between one page of the Talmud and where the same text appears elsewhere in the Talmud, or how things actually played out with halacha, with like what is the bottom line. So these were some of the things that different people added to various versions of the Talmud.
Also, did that say that the Talmud was destroyed like 3 times?
Yeah, different places.
Okay, so okay.
Okay. Let's move on. The Talmud in modernity. In the 1800s, the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Judaism endeavor, got underway, inspired by the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. It proposed to study the Talmud academically as a piece of literature. In 1867, Marcus Jastrow produced a dictionary for the Talmud. Today, this dictionary is known as Jastrow, and it is also available on Sefaria.org. In 1885, the Reform movement in the United States issued the Pittsburgh Platform. It anchored the Reform movement solely in the Bible and implicitly rejected the Talmud as an authority. However, by the 1937 Columbus Platform, the Talmud was considered okay. This, plus the Trefa banquet of the 1883 graduating class of Hebrew Union College, was too much for some American rabbis, and in 1887, the conservative movement's Jewish Theological Seminary was founded with a constitution that dedicated itself to, quote, historical Judaism as found in, quote, biblical and Talmudic writings. In the late 1800s, there was a printing press in Vilna that took the Bomberg printing of the Talmud and standardized it. It became known as, quote, the Vilna edition, or the Vilna Daf, and from then on, the page was frozen. Across the Atlantic, Meir Shapiro was an Orthodox rabbi who sat in the Polish parliament. He was also concerned that only the elites in the Jewish community were studying Talmud. In 1923, he proposed Daf Yomi, whereby ordinary people would gather in groups to study one page front and back each day, and it began in 1924. This continues today. After World War II, there were no copies of the Talmud available for those who wanted to learn in the displaced persons camps. The American Army had 100 copies of, quote, the Survivors' Talmud, printed on German printing presses that made propaganda for the Nazis. The first serious translation of the Talmud into English was by Isidore Epstein in 1952. It was published by the Sonsino Press and is referred to as, quote, the Sonsino. In 1984, Rabbi Adin Steinschaltz published his version of the Talmud, where he put vowels and punctuation into the text. This was a big deal at the time. He also put his translation in Hebrew and later English, an explanation next to the text. So if you weren't sure what was going on, you can consult his explanation. There were also charts occasionally. In 1997, ArtScroll published the Schottenstein edition in English. This had explanatory text linking the words that are actually in the Talmud and also had commentary on each page. Unlike the Steinsaltz edition, it had the Vilna Daf opposite the English, and it brought a religious viewpoint instead of an academic one, which is where the Steinsaltz came from. The next major translation was the 1912 Koran edition, which Steinsaltz contributed greatly. The Aramaic and the Rashi is vowelized, and the English translation also has sidebars explaining terms and people. There are also many diagrams. Finally, Sefaria.org came online in 2012 with the William Davidson edition of the Talmud released in 2017. This made the Talmud more accessible than anything else, because you can now access the entire Talmud on your phone instead of needing to carry around an entire bookcase. Although it's online, it uses the pagination of the Bomberg edition to maintain consistency. And the Talmud continues to affect us today. In 2022, a lawyer for the Chicago City Council decided to annotate the discussions about what the city ordinances meant so that future generations would know the thinking behind them. And he did this after learning about the Talmud. Now, in recognition of the time, I'm going to tell you what's in the rest of this, and then I'll stay after if you have questions. So what's actually in the Talmud? So we have first what is in the very first Mishnah of Tractate Brachot. It's a question: when can you start saying the Shema in the evening? It's one answer, then it's up to 3 answers about how late you can say the evening Shema, and it's a story to illustrate the final answer. The whole thing takes 13 lines of very narrow columns. The Gemara on these 13 lines takes 8 pages double-sided. And this source sheet then lays out exactly what is in that text. So it starts with the Mishnah. It goes on to texts about King David and Moses and miracles and the services and Ashrei and nonstop flights of angels. It goes on beauty, how to avoid miscarriages, how to detect demons, whether God wears tefillin, a whole, what God says, a whole variety of things. Every once in a while it comes back to the Mishnah, advice about not cutting meat on your hand. And so you can see, even very quickly, how the Gemara is much less focused. And part of the challenge of learning Talmud is figuring out the logical jumps. If we were just talking about this, how did we get to talking about that? After this, we have a color-coded Talmud page where you can see all the different pieces of the Talmud page, and then a handy key that tells you who came up with it and where they lived and when they lived and what's going on there. So this is very helpful. And then finally, here's a video from Unpacked, which has fantastic videos about Judaism on YouTube, and this debriefs what is the Talmud. So, thank you for joining me for this.